perfect neighbourhood look like to you? We've all got a picture. Perhaps a classic wide Californian suburban street in the noonday sun. Palm trees lining the avenue. It's quiet, it's peaceful. Or maybe you prefer the bustling city atmosphere. The sights and the lights, the smells from all the corners of the globe wafting through the window. And what would that neighbourhood be like? What would it feel like to live there? For some, perhaps very private. Keeping out of one another's way, respecting each other's personal spaces, the slices of the world that they keep behind closed doors. For others, perhaps a sort of nostalgia for the 60s and 70s communal streets, where kids play together between houses. You're on first name terms with the mailman. You've got decent neighbours, you get on with them nicely. Well, hi, I'm James, and in Exodus 21:33 to 23:9, God sets out what perfect neighbourhood really looks like. He does so first to show his ancient covenant community, Israel, how to live as his holy nation. And he also does so to show us what it truly looks like to be a perfect society. At the perfect society's heart is a genuine care for one another. Or to put it another way, the law of Exodus 22 not only prohibits one type of behaviour, but lifts up the principle behind that prohibition as the goal of the society-minded citizen. Let's see how we get there. Every example, every case in Exodus 22 enshrines or lifts up as an ideal each person's responsibility to care for the people that they live in society with. These laws do this by establishing the legal duty to somebody that they harm. If you look at Exodus 21 verse 33, the man who digs a pit is responsible to someone whose property falls in it and gets harmed if he leaves it uncovered. The legal duty of the digger to the owner is established by the law, but the law does not just create that legal duty, it also lifts up the principle that the digger should be concerned for other people's interests. As he digs, he ought to be thoughtful for anyone whose property might get injured if it fell in his pit. And we see this in modern law. Murder legislation, for instance, both establishes the illegality of killing in almost every circumstance, and simultaneously lifts up the value of life within the society. Not only ought I recognise my guilt if I unlawfully kill somebody, but as a member of that society, I should also seek not to kill people. It's not anything morally advantageous to say I didn't kill somebody if the only thing stopping me was the law. The law teaches me that I should desire not to kill people. And we can see this in the scenarios from 21:33 through to chapter 22 verse 15. 21:35-36. One ought to be proactive to avoid causing his neighbour any harm by misusing or neglecting his own property. 22:1-4. Those who would steal ought to prefer the owner's rights to their desires. The owner who comes across a thief in the night should care for the thief's life when he can be brought to justice without killing him. 22:5-14 applies the same principle to a range of day-to-day friendly neighbourly issues. What does it look like to really care for your neighbour's welfare and possessions when you're making a fire near his field? Or looking after something for him? Or borrowing something from him? God's law turns the individual members of the society outward in love and concern for those in their community. Now we see this especially clearly in the directions in chapter 22 from 16 through to 23:9. Genuine neighbour care in perfect society looks like radical concern for one another and radical concern for the vulnerable and the needy. Although Hemant says of verse 22, for instance, that
the implication here is that you can take advantage of women if their daddies are still around, because if they complain, God's not going to listen and you will face no consequences.
he misreads the verse. Does a charity specialism in cancer research imply that heart disease or diabetes are just less important issues? Well, of course not. It's just focusing on one problem. In the same way, God's law seeks in 22 verses 21 to 26 and 23 1 to 9 to protect those who have no one to care for them, no one who will look out for them. You see 22:21, don't hate the foreigner, treat them as one of your own. 22 verses 22 to 24, don't take advantage of the widows, the orphans, care for them. 22:25 to 26, don't profit off the poor, be sure to comfort them. That's what's meant by returning the cloak at night. If a poor person should take out a loan and gives his cloak as collateral, the lender ought to return it every night so that they can stay warm. Just as God is compassionate to his cries, so members of this society are called to be compassionate to those in need. Chapter 23, 1 to 9, don't pervert the course of justice for evil or even for good. Just because you see somebody poor who would benefit doesn't mean that bending the system is a good thing to do. The ends don't justify the means. Imagine what that ideal community would look like if your neighbour thought twice about that 7 a.m. DIY project against your bedroom door on a Saturday. Or if the bin man put your bin back where he found it rather than halfway down the road. If people parked a little further apart so they didn't risk scratching one another's cars or causing you to do that tight shuffle in a tight spot. If there was no threat of theft, not because you spent hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month on the state-of-the-art security, but because people respect your rights to your stuff. If no woman ever felt taken advantage of, but rather wonderfully cared for by the community. If the vulnerable and the helpless were cared for and protected rather than maligned and ignored. If people sought charity over self-gain, refused to follow the crowd for the sake of acceptance, stood up for justice, showing partiality to no one, but rather dispensing fairness. It's a beautiful picture, this society. This might seem like a fantasy, but the law is not hopelessly idealistic. It aspires to great heights, yet is practically realistic and just. Each scenario comes with a penalty for infraction. But more important than the specific penalties for each case is the principle behind them. For every harm or damage done to one's neighbour, right restitution, right compensation is made. For causing you harm and damage, I owe you something. And this compensation is not an arbitrary sum. In each case, it is like for like repayment. The value of that was taken, either by returning what was stolen, or replacing it with your own, or paying back its value, plus some excess for the trouble caused. The increased interest that the thief owes on the ox or sheep pays for the animal taken, and in the case of verse 1 of chapter 22, for also having killed an animal that the owner cared for. This is about more than just a price tag. And this is so that once the owner has recouped his losses and some excess, he need not think of the other person as still owing him something. You see, the relationship between the two of them can be restored because that debt has been wiped out. You can't live in this sort of loving community with someone who thinks you owe them something. You can't properly care for someone who you think has got one over on you. That sense of outstanding debt will lead to unhappiness, a fractured relationship between the two, and the community will become slightly less other-focused. This goes well beyond modern civil settlements. Sums are not inflated. Payouts go to the claimant rather than the government, legal reps, or the insurer. The system isn't used to enable third parties to profit off the dispute, but to reconcile the actual people involved. These laws prioritise a society where people care deeply for one another, in part by providing a mechanism to weed out a key cause of societal breakdown. But as I film today, the news paints a very different picture of society. A man tricked out of $250,000 by an Eastern European wedding scam. A couple who, 20 years after being forced by their employer to pay £17,000 caused by a software error, still awaiting remuneration. Concerns about possible systemic educational neglect of children from poorer families. In Greece, a man was due to testify yesterday about how he may have covered up his wife's murder. And questions still stand over whether Dubai royal Princess Latifah is truly free. Our society is far from the vision that God gave to Israel. Why is that? The news stories, they say it all. We don't care for one another the way that Exodus 22 describes. The post office in the UK are more concerned with its bottom line than the financial solvency of a poor couple caught out by faulty accountancy software. A syndicate cared more for the financial gain to be had by tricking a charity worker into thinking he was getting married than the harm they would do to him. And so on. Again and again we see that we are bent inwards towards our own needs, our own desires, our wants. And so do not look outwards in the way Exodus 22 calls us to. The Exodus 22 society has a staggeringly high demand. We might fob some of this off as general charity and neighbourly niceness, but Jesus gets the precedent for the parable of the Good Samaritan from 23 verses 4 and 5. The community's bottom line is to show love to those that we hate, or who hate us. The call is to forego the anger of hating an enemy, or to refuse to be proud in the face of somebody who hates us, and to care for them and their needs. And if this is how we must care for our enemies, the standard is set high for everybody we'd possibly meet. To be devoted to people around us in this way is to deny everything that feels natural to ourselves. Comfort, the easy life, quick gain, our sense of deserts, rights, justice. It is to accept the burden of responsibility to one another. Accountability, the emotional highs and lows of another's life. And we don't seek those things. Heman's master plan to become king of the donkeys proves that we really don't want to live the way the law calls us to. The fact that we look for the loopholes shows that we're not concerned, we're not burdened by the priorities set out in it. Rather than genuine costly care of our neighbours, we'd rather our own comfort and prosperity. We'd rather relish in the struggle of those we dislike and who dislike us than rise to the challenge and the call to love them radically. The Exodus 22 society is a beautiful picture, but it's also an indictment. Because as we look at it, we realise we're not willing to pay the price necessary to bring this community into being. And this is because we prioritise ourselves over God. We may like the sound of this society, but we'd rather if we could dispense with the God bit, do it on our own terms. We feel the law goes a bit wonky at verses 16 through 20, 28 to 31. It's a bit religious. So if we could chop those bits out, we'd be all the better. But that's just not true. The Exodus 22 community is fueled by the call of the Creator to live for Him, that in devotion to Him, it may love one another rightly. That's why 28 to 31 sits where it does. Give God first priority in all of your life. Don't revile him or a ruler he puts in place. Long to give him the first fruits of the harvest, of your family, of your cattle, of your very life. Forego the things that will keep you from me, says the Lord in verse 31. Be consecrated to me. Be concerned for the things that I am concerned for. Because when you want what I want, then you'll move radically in love towards those around you, even your enemies. That's how you'll be a good citizen in the perfect society. But we don't. None of us want to allow God that first place in our lives. And trying to be a God-fueled society without God is like trying to use a remote-controlled car with the battery still in your pocket. We aren't capable of living this community out on our own. That's because our morals aren't God's morals. As we just saw, it would be so much easier if the laws of 16 through 20 weren't in the passage. We can denounce 16 to 17 as sexist, 18 as antiquated, 19 might be on the right lines.
You know what? Fine. The death penalty is always wrong, except maybe in this case.
But 20 is definitely irrelevant. But as we start picking and choosing which parts of God's law are essential and which can be scrapped, the whole community starts to crumble. Just take 16 and 17 as an example. If God's standard for morality doesn't matter, sleeping around and the impact that it has on one another doesn't really mean anything. Our community of radical concern for one another suddenly shifts, it transforms into one where some people use one another for self-gratification and others suffer significant emotional and sometimes life-changing consequences. I'm not saying that's true in every case, but in a good majority. A recent pop song is just one example. The lyrics here. It's 5 a.m. when you close the door, I don't know who I am anymore. And tell me, did you make your eyes blur so that in the dark I'd look like her? 4 tequilas down, who cares if we're messing around? They'll never know, they'll never know. So just hold me like you mean it. We'll pretend because we need it. And verse 2. Who knew I could be so brave? Though I know it shouldn't be this way, and it's wrong, more wrong, the deeper I sink. Oh, kiss me before I start to think. Oh, 4 tequilas down. Who cares if we're messing around? They'll never know. So just hold me like you mean it. We'll pretend because we need it. This is liberation from those old-fashioned rules. A freedom of deep emotional pain and hurt. Our music charts are full of these sorts of admissions. For as many ballads and songs about the highs of love, there are easily double that for heartbreak and emotional breakdown. And we know people ourselves who've been broken by sexual freedom. Rather than being a community deeply concerned for the well-being of one another, when we start to remove these morals, some become focused on self-gratification and others get seriously injured. We stop being concerned for one another. This is just one example. And it's by no means the most important, but it helps us to see how these principles snowball and then extrapolate. The more self-interested we become, the less proactive we are in the cause of the vulnerable and afflicted, more likely to pervert justice for our own gain. Slowly, the culture that we see depicted in Exodus 22 fractures and fragments into, well, the society we live in today. But this is not just a societal issue, it's a relational one too. It's not just the inability to recreate the perfect society that we suffer from. The first 4 commandments are all about right relationship with God, the one who is indispensable to the Exodus 22 community. Verses 18 to 20 show us that while there are certain things we can seek reconciliation over, other crimes are of a fundamentally different jurisdiction that we have no right to resolve ourselves. Though we perhaps prefer to throw them out as irrelevant, the relational God who builds community here shows that just as we might commit a crime against our fellow neighbour, when we live in certain ways, we commit crimes against God. Rejecting God's personhood, his right to be offended by the sorceress and by idol worship, is to think of him as less of a person than you or I. We may not yet know his reasons, but that doesn't mean they can't exist. These verses show that whether we admit it or not, God sits in authority over the world, and that failing to live up to the call of holiness is to be out of relationship with him. Our failing incurs a debt infinitely more significant than those indicated between neighbours in Exodus 22. And we all fail. We are all guilty of that idolatry. None of us allow God his rightful place at the centre of our lives. And the sentence is death. As we stand in the divine courtroom, the verdict is handed down guilty on all charges. Our situation is infinitely more bleak than the brokenness of our communities. And yet there is hope. Because just as God has called us to live together in community, so he has worked to relate to us in the same ways. Or to put it another way, in the way that he has given us a model of how to relate to one another, so too has he shown himself to relate to us in exactly the same way. Though our self-interest has fractured our relationship with God, he came in his Son, in Jesus, to reconcile us to himself. Like the man who owes his neighbour a donkey, we owe God a debt. And Jesus came to meet the cost that we could not pay by dying in our place. Though we have failed to look out for one another through God's strength, Jesus came to care for us in the way that only he could, by living the perfect, covenant-filling life that satisfied the demand of the law, so that his death would not just acquit us of our guilt, but also restore us to a good relationship with our Creator. Jesus came to us in our weakness, our vulnerability, to offer us strength in him. Though we have cultivated a hatred for God and for people around us, God came into the world to save his enemies. Jesus didn't just point us in the direction of how to live well, but pulled us out of the pit that we'd fallen into, cleaned us off and made us well. And we were as far from him as we could be. You see, in the person of Jesus, God has shown himself to be exactly the person who lives out this sort of society and can fuel our living out of this society in the hope that he holds out in this gospel. A God-centered life is the only life that has the power to live out that Exodus 22 community. It looks forward to the day where there'll be never need for neighbour-to-neighbour reconciliation again, when all those trusting in God will be perfected in true holiness in the new creation. The true perfect society with God exalted at the centre. This is the glimpse that Exodus 22 offers us. This is the hope that is held out to us in the gospel. If these things are true, then they are infinitely important. I implore you to consider these things carefully. Don't neglect God's loving provision. Explore what the Bible has to say for yourself. Seek answers to questions raised here or that you already have. If you've got any thoughts or questions that you'd like to leave in the comments, I try to get to them weekly. I'd love to discuss with you what you're thinking. If you'd like to be kept up to date with the regular videos coming out, then do subscribe. If you found this helpful and would like to let me know, then please like. But the most important thing is not to leave the thoughts that have been had here. I would much prefer you ignored me than ignored the claims of God here in Exodus 22. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to exploring Exodus 23 next week.